Hello, everyone. Miles here, co-founder of Tech Circus, joined today by Jason Cranford Teague, who is a UX leader and self-confessed sci-fi enthusiast, now specializing in spatial computing. And it's an important conversation today because we also have the exciting Metaverse Day coming up this January, where Jason's going to be joining us actually on a panel to talk about user experience in the metaverse. So Jason, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Good to be here. Good to be here. I really like the Tech Circus events I've been to. Very useful information at those.
Amazing. No, I appreciate that, Jason. So I'd love to dive straight in with a bit of your background. Like you're now here. We're going to be talking about spatial design today. But what's brought you here from a practitioner in, well, perhaps even before being in the UX and design space today? The whistle stop tour.
Well, virtual reality and what we've now started to call extended reality, although that term seems to be fairly recent, has been an interest of mine since I was quite young, in my teens at least. When as you mentioned, I read a lot of science fiction, and back in the 80s, I started reading a lot of stories that dealt with not just using computers, but kind of entering into that computer space. And that interest had started even as far back as Doctor Who. One of the earliest, examples of virtual reality was an episode of Doctor Who called The Deadly Assassin, where the Doctor enters into the Time Lord's big computer, which was literally called in the show The Matrix, by putting on a helmet and entering into this simulated reality where he goes and fights the Master. And ever since then, I have been very interested in, okay, how do we move beyond, screens? How do we move beyond interacting with very obvious computer interfaces and code and the like? And all through that time, I read books by William Gibson, Bruce Sterling, and then later Jeff Noon, who had a very interesting take on virtual reality in his book Vert. To the point that for my senior dissertation at university, I wrote it. I was an English major, so I wasn't even doing computer science or anything. I wrote it on cyberpunk literature, as it had become known by then. And I was very fascinated by this idea of entering in these virtual spaces and what it might mean to humanity. And at the time, there was a lot of excitement around the idea of virtual worlds. At the time, we were referring, though, to cyberspace, which is actually a term I'm trying to kind of bring back. I think given the kind of some of the confusion with meta and both the concept and the company, cyberspace might be due for a resuscitation as a term to kind of refer to that virtual world that we enter. And then when I went on to get my master's degree in technical communication, I wrote a paper called Headed for the Promised Land, Cyberspace and the Next Great Leap of Faith. And I began to realize that, there were these promises being made about what it was going to mean to enter cyberspace or the virtual world. And at first I was very taken by it. I went to a lot of lectures on VR at the time, and a lot of product demos. I remember hanging out in a cyber cafe in and around Harvard University, where they had like an arcade and VR arcade games and stuff like that, and was very fascinated by it. But over the next decade, I guess, really, I kept hearing that promise. Oh, VR is going to be the next big thing. It's just 3 years away until we have a full commercially viable product. And then 3 years later, I'd go to another talk on it. It's just 3 years away. And then again, 3 years later, it's just 3 years away. And by the early 2000s, I began to believe, okay, VR, cyberspace is always going to be 3 years away. It always feels like it is just 3 years away from our grasping it and it becoming an actual, uh, you know, beyond just niche, beyond just very specific applications, becoming a real way in which humans are going to interact with each other through computers. And so about that time, I started to become more of a skeptic, really, than a promoter. You know, and so I've watched it over the years. I've still studied it. I still read. I still follow the latest trends, but it never seemed to catch on. And so that's where I have been until really this summer. Anybody who would talk to me about cyberspace, I'd be like, well, let's wait another 3 years and see what happens.
It seems to be around the corner, right? It's ever closer.
Yeah, it's always around the corner. Yeah,
and
it's like a rainbow. It's just right. It's just right, almost within our grasp. But
it seems like now more than ever, the big tech companies are diving into this space, and the hardware is coming leaps and bounds ahead. Obviously, we've got Apple launching the Vision Pro in the new year, which we talked about earlier, probably being, the top end product. But how do you think about those introductions of technology on the hardware and software side, and with this kind of resurgence of the metaverse, decentralization all coming around, and all of these different technologies kind of converging? Do you think we are actually going to be close to 3 years away? Where do you think we are now?
I think we are at approaching a tipping point. And I think the Apple Vision Pro, it will be, it's important to watch how the Apple Vision Pro is not only received, but adapted by users. The thing that I think Apple Vision Pro has done right, that I have never seen any other technology do, whether it's the Meta Quest or the Magic Leap, was a technology that I was very excited about when I first saw it, and then I realized, no, they can't do what they say they're going to be able to do. That's just not going to be the way it is. And so, as a result, I think a lot of people like myself lost heart in the possibility because another promise was broken. But Apple has a strong track record of being able to make and fulfill promises. Now, I don't want to get into a Twitter debate about broken promises, but in general, Apple will read the industry and then come out with a product that's really going to fulfill a need, not just a want, not just some kind of sci-fi esoteric dream of what the future could be like. And I see that in the Apple Vision Pro, which I think they very smartly have not tried to position as a consumer product. It is a high-end product that is essentially, despite the fact that it can do, you can use it for entertainment, you can watch movies, you can play games, it's really meant to replace the laptop and desktop computer. Because of its bulkiness, because of its battery, because of its its rather large face print, it's not going to be a product that you're going to see people wearing around on the street, but it is going to be something I think that people will adapt because it does one of the most important things that VR can do now, which is overcome the limitations of the fixed screen. Not only in terms of providing the three-dimensionality, but also the infinite workspace. Right now, we're very limited. We don't even really think about it because it's just such a part of our way we work that we're limited to these screens. If you want another screen, you have to go out and purchase one. You have to spend anywhere from hundreds to thousands of dollars to get another screen. Whereas with the VR or the Apple Vision Pro, you just hit a button, boom, there's another screen, boom, there's another screen. And it's allowing us to have that infinite workspace that we are limited to, by with current laptop and desktop computers. And I think that's going to be the fundamental change that we're going to see, why people embrace it. I think especially amongst the design and development community, who, oftentimes struggle because, we're constantly shifting windows around, and we're constantly opening this app and that app, and we're having to move. And once all of that information is just displayed in a vista in front of us, I think that's going to be a huge game changer. And then it will build on from there in terms of getting that adaptation by the the early adapters, the early tech adapters. I think it will build on from there.
You touched on the implications for designers and developers, but I'd love to come at this from the other lens. Like, as a designer, what are some of the idiosyncrasies of designing spatial experiences, and looking at those key differences between, as we talked about, flat graphic interfaces that we're used to designing for, into now spatial environments?
Right. Well, and I think that the biggest change, we talk a lot about it's adding depth, it's adding a Z to our X, Y. But what I think we're going to find as we begin to really start thinking about how our designs will change in the virtual world is actually perspective. If you look at the history of art, around the Renaissance painters discovered perspective. They discovered that if we, use a little bit of geometry and a little bit of graphing, we can actually make this wall look like you're standing in front of a space. In a way, you could argue that, those paintings were early VR, because they were not just presenting a flat surface with figures on it like most art previous to that. They were literally trying to punch through that wall, punch through that space to create the impression of 3 dimensions. And I think UX is about to undergo as radical a change, where we are not just going to be thinking about a flat screen with links and flat images and everything flat. We're going to start thinking in terms of, how do we design systems that make use of perspective and make use of distance in order to allow for more, not just interaction, but better information display, better information architecture, better interaction with the interface, not just a gimmick. If you look at the fact that 3D movies have never really caught on, and that was something I did a lot of study back in the early 2010s. I toured 3D cinematography studios. I looked at all of that, and I was very impressed. But the problem was, it was still very much ersatz, if you know that term. It was faking it. It still didn't have a feeling of 3-dimensionality to it. It was just kind of like a faking it. And it just didn't really impress people. The benefits of that weren't worth it. And I think the cinematographers of the time, while some were very taken with the glitz of 3D movie making, I rarely see anything being presented in 3D anymore. Maybe I'm not paying attention, but I don't see theaters showing 3D movies, or let's go. And it definitely didn't become everything is 3D. And then I think that was also because a lot of people really just couldn't, the technology, while the majority of people could see 3D, there was still a significant portion of people who simply could not see that 3D because of the technology. And I think that will change now with the 3D technology that we're seeing today. Really, when you reduce it down, it is still a simulation, though. It's essentially holding 2 very high resolution but small screens right in front of your eyeballs. But hopefully that will be a technology that will work for more and more people. So this idea of perspective, of how do we design for perspective, not just for informational hierarchy in a flat space, but informational hierarchy in a three-dimensional space. When we look around our real world, for example, I was thinking about this last night. I was looking around my room and I looked over my bookshelf. I can tell a lot about the books on my shelf by the width of the spine. Okay. If it's a wider spine, I know it's more information in that book. I know if it's a taller book, there's going to be more information in that book. I can tell a lot by the color and the art on the spine. There's a lot of information that we get in our 3D world that is pretty much absent from the 2D world of digital design today. And I think we're going to see more and more emphasis put on communicating information through geometry, through space, through size, through distance, than we have in the past. Now, I could be wrong, and it could be that that's just no, our brains aren't really set up not so much to accept that, but to think about how to design that, because that adds a huge level of complexity for the designer, because the designer has to think about all those things. The designer has to think, okay, what does it mean when my link is larger than another link, or my object over here is a different size and shape than this one over here. In the natural world, it just happens. In the natural world, we are constrained by the physicality of the objects that we make and create. In the virtual world, we're going to have to think about what it means, what those sizes and what all those different traits mean. And so that level of complexity is something I think we have to start taking on now and adjusting for now, rather than waiting until it's already happened.
So no longer hidden behind hamburger menus. It will all be kind of in the space around us.
Like walking over to a bookshelf.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. When it comes to spatial experiences, are there any kind of, without going into too much depth, sort of key principles and considerations that a designer should be thinking about at the high level? I know that you would get into a lot more of this in your workshop, so just the high level.
Well, there are several. The first is spatial awareness. It's not going to be enough to simply present, some fancy graphics, a nicely rendered, a nicely rendered 3D object or some sort of abstract pattern. We're really going to have to consider every element on the screen and how not just it informs us, but does it make us aware of the space that we're in? A lot of environments now are trying to simulate the world you literally is right in front of your eyes. That's one of the things the Apple Vision Pro is doing. I would argue the Apple Vision Pro, they bill it as a augmented reality or a mixed reality. But really, I think it's pure VR, because the world you see in front of you is captured by cameras and then put on the screen and then projected into your eye. Your eyes aren't directly seeing the world around you. And so that intermediary between you and the real world, it can do all sorts of things. So for example, if I'm not wearing a VR headset and I look out a window and I see a building across the street, I know I can walk over to that building. I can touch that building. But with VR, it might be presenting that real world to me. I might see that building, but because it's being intermediated by a computer, I don't know that I can walk over to that building and touch it. Even if, sci-fi, we had a world where that kind of haptic tactile sensations could be done. The computer is controlling all of that. And the computer, the programmer, let's be honest, can change that however they want. They can make the building melt. They can make the building explode. They can make it just suddenly disappear. And we're going to have to make sure people feel comfortable with that spatial awareness. I would say um, next is also wayfinding related to spatial awareness. How are we going to help users find their way through this? Again, in the real world, we don't really think too much about wayfinding per se. If I see something across the street, I walk to that thing across the street. If I'm wanting to go down to the shops, in my brain, I've got a rough idea where the shops are, and I just start walking. So, how are we going to help people find their ways around in these spaces? And then, obviously, interaction design. At what level do we change reality through our interactions? Because, if all we're doing is recreating the world around us, well, we've got the world around us, there's not much benefit in that. So unless we can use that, those interactions, the changing of reality for better interactions, there's not much point in virtual reality. And then finally, I would say getting back to perspective again. How do we think about perspective? How is perspective? And here I'm using the term, I'm being a little bit duplicitous here because I'm using the term for both of its meanings. Not only perspective in view, in sight, but also the user's perspective. What is their point of view? And so, really, perspective takes on two meanings: point of view and literal visual perspective. And that, I think, is going to be the hardest thing for designers to not only get their heads around, but really start designing for. And that's one of my key interests right now, is in doing that. I'll also say, though, there are obviously a lot of issues with virtual reality and extended reality and cyberspace. I'll throw that term in there again. Um, and I break them down into physical, psychological, and social. The physical problems are pretty obvious. Most people are talking about the physical problems. It's a big, bulky headset that you wear. It can cause neck problems. It can cause something called cyber sickness, where it's eye strain and feelings of vertigo, where your body is seeing something, but your ears maybe aren't sensing that motion. They aren't sensing the space, which again gets back into why wayfinding and interactive design and spatial awareness are going to be so key. But those are mostly going to be overcome through better applications of technology. Um, the psychological is still something we're learning about, but we have a lot of work already being done with how we are being affected by our handheld devices, by our mobile devices. There's a lot of psychological literature and research right now on that immersive use of those devices and how they might isolate us, how they might cut us off from humanity rather than connecting us with humanity. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that. But then I think the hardest issue to overcome, and actually getting back to the whole 3 years later problem, I think this is actually one of the key issues that has kept VR at 3 years away, and that is the social issues of ostracism. People walking around, if you remember when the Google Glass came out, there were the glass holes, everybody was talking, people would ostracize people wearing Google Glass, and often for good reason, because with a handheld device, a phone device, a smartphone, if I hold it up and point the camera at you, there's only one purpose in doing that, and that's to take a picture of you. Normally, you're going to be holding it down here and looking down at it. If you hold it up like that, it's probably because you're trying to take a picture of somebody. With VR, even very subtle VR, even if it looks just like a pair of glasses, if there are cameras on the end of that, you're constantly going to be distrustful as to whether that person is filming you, taking your picture, recording what you're doing without your permission, or even if they have your permission, there's still that, I might say something inadvertently that I wish wasn't preserved for the rest of history to be used against me. And so I think those social problems are going to be some of the ones that we're going to be most difficult to overcome for a more commercial and personal use of virtual reality devices or augmented reality devices even.
I'm glad you're thinking so deeply about it. I think that's what is really valuable to designers listening in today, and it leads us well onto where you are today and what you're doing and why we're talking today. So, Jason and I have been working on crafting an introductory workshop for members of the Tech Circus community, where he'll be talking at the high level about spatial design, and I'm going to let Jason go into a bit more detail. But this is all as a feeder into a much broader course that Jason is building, and I'd love to give you the floor, Jason.
What I'm hoping to do is, right now we're barely even dipping our toes into the ocean of what spatial design is going to be capable of, and we might decide to retreat back from that ocean and never want to go near that thing again. It might be something that humanity, at least at this point in time, isn't ready. I'm sorry, getting a little bit philosophical here, but the state of the art right now is very niche driven. It is very purpose driven. Again, getting back to the Apple Vision Pro, I am not a Apple employee. They've turned me down a couple of times, but right now, what it's doing is not trying to take on a commercial product. It's trying to take on a wider use case, which is replacing the laptop and desktop computer, but not doing so in a way that relies on it being widely adapted by people, and by I hate to use the word consumers because they're people. But that state of the art is going to grow from there, and so that's what I want to explore in my workshop, in the upcoming workshop at the end of the month. Is what is that going to mean? How can that grow? Not how is it? I do think about the future a lot, but one thing I know about thinking about the future is there are a lot of paths this could take, and there are a lot of different variables that may or may not come about, with different possibilities that will control what happens. But I do think it is at a point now where we can start talking about the user's experience in those spaces and be at the forefront of driving how the user's experience of those devices can be made as useful as possible, how it can benefit the user as much as possible. We'll talk about, who controls this right now, who controls this experience, and how do we get in there to ensure that the user is not mistreated, not simply used as a consumer, and how that audience and the actors within that. One thing I've tried to do over the years is move away from the term user, because there's a joke in the industry that there's only one other industry that refers to their clients as users, and there's a reason for that, because it can be addictive. And so I'm going to start. I try to think of these as actors now, and I think with VR, it's even going to become more apparent to think of them as actors on a stage rather than users, in a dark room somewhere. But then also, I want to look at some of the, it's not enough to just talk about the philosophy and thinking about where we're going. It's how do we make that happen now? So we'll present some of the tools that that we can start using now to start planning and thinking about actual virtual reality spaces, actual spatial design, UX for spatial design. And that then will carry into the course I'm giving early next year, where I go more in depth into that and how to use those tools, how to start thinking about perspective in digital design, how to start thinking about the interaction, how to think about wayfinding, and how to think about how to think about perspective. That's my big one right there. And so that's what I'll be going over in the workshop coming out. We'll start with a little bit theoretical, but that's because I like to set the ground for the practical. So start with the theoretical and then move into the practical. Hopefully smoothly.
Well, I'm very excited for that. And if you're watching this video on any of our social channels however it's reached you, there will be a link for you to register. It'll be 6 p.m. UK time. So if you're joining from the UK, it's your evening. If you're joining in the States, it's probably around lunchtime somewhere. And we'd love to have you. Come and learn with Jason about the fundamentals of spatial design, and how it's going to impact your craft for the future. And yeah, please check out, come and join Jason and I next year as well, January 24th and 25th, where we'll be talking again in more depth on a panel about user experience and the future of the metaverse. So thanks so much for joining us, Jason. I really appreciate your insights today.
Yeah, thanks, Miles. Thanks for talking with me.
Looking forward to the session. Bye for now.